There is a particular shape that tragedy takes in these old stories, when a man is given absolutely everything. A winged horse born of a god's own blood, the favor of Athena herself, victory over a monster no mortal had ever faced and lived, and still, in the end, cannot bring himself to stop reaching. Tonight we follow a hero who survived a death sentence, disguised as a hunting trip, tamed the only winged horse in all of creation, and slew a fire-breathing monster stitched together from 3 different animals that should never have shared a single body. And then, having done all of that, having been given more than almost any mortal in these old tales was ever given, he looked up at Olympus itself and decided that he had not yet been given enough. This is the story of Bellerophon, and it begins as these stories about pride so often do, with an accident, a lie, and a letter that its own carrier never knew he was delivering. He was born, by most tellings, a prince of Corinth, grandson of the cunning Sisyphus, whose own endless punishment in the underworld we have already followed on this channel. And his early life gave no particular sign of the extraordinary heights and equally extraordinary fall that waited for him. Some of the old poets even whisper that his true father was not the mortal king of Corinth at all, but Poseidon himself, lord of the sea, and, fittingly enough for this particular story, the god most closely associated with horses in all the Greek imagination, a detail worth holding on to, since it is a horse more than any sword or spear that will carry Bellerophon to both the summit and the ruin of his entire life. But whatever the truth of his parentage, his young life in Corinth ended abruptly and violently, the way so many heroic careers in these old tales begin, not with a quest freely chosen, but with a crime that could not be undone. In a hunting accident, or in a fit of temper, the old tellings never quite agree on, Bellerophon killed a man. Some say it was his own brother. Whichever version you believe, the result was the same: blood guilt, a stain that could not simply be washed away by grief or good intentions, an exile from the only home he had ever known. Driven out of Corinth to wander as a supplicant, seeking out some foreign king generous enough to perform the ancient rite that alone could cleanse a man of an unintentional killing. He found that generosity in Tiryns, at the court of King Proetus, who received the young exile kindly and performed the purification rites that lifted the blood guilt from him and welcomed him into his own household as an honored guest, which, in the old and sacred laws of hospitality that governed nearly every interaction between strangers in this world, meant something far more binding than simple courtesy. A guest under a king's roof was owed protection, and in turn owed loyalty, and to violate that bond in either direction was considered one of the deepest offenses a person could commit against the gods themselves, who watched over the sacred rites of hospitality more jealously than almost any other human custom. Bellerophon, grateful for his rescue from exile and blood guilt alike, settled into Proetus's household with every intention of honoring that debt for as long as he remained under the king's roof. But it was not Bellerophon's own conduct that would eventually threaten to unravel everything. It was the queen's. Antea, wife of Proetus, looked upon the young and handsome exile living now in her own household, and found herself seized by a desire she had no right to feel for a man under her husband's protection. And she came to him in secret, and made him an offer that would have shattered every law of hospitality either of them owed to Proetus, had Bellerophon accepted it. He refused her, cleanly and completely, understanding with total clarity exactly what such a betrayal would mean. Not merely a personal wrong, but a violation of the very guest bond that had saved his life and cleansed his guilt in the first place. It is worth pausing on this refusal, because it tells us plainly, before anything else in his story unfolds, exactly what kind of man Bellerophon was at his best, a man who understood debt and honored it, even when honoring it cost him something he might easily have taken instead. But a woman scorned in these old stories, especially a queen scorned, rarely accepts rejection quietly, and Antea, humiliated and furious at being refused, did what so many wronged pursuers in these tales eventually do when their desire curdles into vengeance. She went to her husband, and she lied. She told Proetus that it was Bellerophon who had tried to force himself upon her, twisting the truth completely, turning the one man in the household who had actually honored his obligations into the very villain who had supposedly betrayed them. Proetus believed her, or at least believed her enough to want the young man dead. But here the same sacred law of hospitality that had bound Bellerophon to loyalty now bound Proetus in the opposite direction. A host could not simply murder his own guest under his own roof, not without inviting the same terrible curse of pollution that Bellerophon himself had once had to be cleansed of. To spill a guest's blood directly would have been an offense against the gods, every bit as grave as the crime Antea had falsely accused him of. And so Proetus, trapped by his own furious desire for vengeance and the sacred law that forbade him from taking it directly, devised a way around the problem that has echoed, in one form or another, through storytelling ever since. He wrote a sealed letter and gave it to Bellerophon himself to carry, telling the young man only that it was an errand of friendship, a letter of introduction to Proetus's own father-in-law, King Iobates of Lycia, across the sea. Bellerophon, still entirely unaware of Antea's lie or of the death sentence he was now personally and unknowingly delivering, took up the letter and sailed for Lycia, carrying, sealed in his own hands, the very instructions for his own murder. A message that read, when Iobates finally opened it, a simple and chilling request from a son-in-law to a father: kill the bearer of this letter. Iobates, following the same ancient customs of hospitality that had already shaped so much of this story, received his unexpected guest warmly, and, as custom in that part of the world required, feasted and entertained him for 9 full days before ever asking his name or the purpose of his visit, for it was considered deeply improper to interrogate a guest before extending several days of proper welcome first. Only on the 10th day did Iobates finally ask to see the letter his son-in-law had sent, and read, with a sinking understanding, exactly what was being asked of him. And Iobates found himself caught in precisely the same trap that had already caught Proetus. He could not kill a guest who had eaten at his own table for 9 days without inviting the same divine punishment that had stopped Proetus from doing the deed himself. So Iobates did what Proetus had already done before him, and passed the problem along one further step removed from his own hands. He would not murder Bellerophon directly. He would simply send him to do something that no man could possibly survive, and let the doing of it accomplish what neither king could bring himself to order outright. He sent Bellerophon to kill the Chimera. And here the story pauses to describe, in full, exactly what kind of horror Iobates was sending an unsuspecting guest to face. That the Chimera was no ordinary beast, and no simple combination of parts either, but something the old poets clearly delighted in making as unnatural and as impossible as language could describe. It had the body and the head of a lion, at its front powerful and golden-maned, but from its back rose the head of a goat, as well, sprouting from the ridge of its spine, and its tail was not a tail at all but a living, hissing serpent, and from the lion's mouth, or by some tellings from the goat's head as well, it breathed fire, raw and unquenchable, scorching the countryside of Lycia wherever it roamed, killing shepherds, and burning entire flocks and villages to ash. It was, the old poets tell us, offspring of Typhon and Echidna, that same monstrous mother and father, who had produced nearly every other great horror of the Greek imagination. And it prowled the land of Lycia with an appetite and a fury that no local hero had yet managed to check. Iobates, sending his unwitting guest against it, fully expected that the fire alone would end the matter before Bellerophon ever got close enough to land a single blow. But Bellerophon, understanding by now, whether through Iobates' own barely concealed intentions, or simply through sheer impossibility of the task set before him, that he was being sent to die, did not despair and did not refuse. Instead, he sought help in the one place a hero facing an impossible task in these old stories so often learns to look, not in his own strength alone, but in wisdom older and wiser than his own. He went to the seer Polyidus, who told him that no mortal could hope to defeat the Chimera on foot, and that his only real chance lay in securing the one creature capable of meeting fire and monstrous ground alike from above, beyond the reach of tooth or flame. He needed Pegasus, the great winged horse, born in a detail this channel has told before, from the blood of the slain Gorgon Medusa in the very instant of her death, a creature so wild and so magnificent that no ordinary bridle or rope had ever yet managed to tame him. Polyidus told Bellerophon to sleep the night in the temple of Athena, and there, in a dream so vivid it seemed more real than his own waking life, the goddess herself came to him and gave him a golden bridle, unlike any bridle ever forged by mortal hands, and told him that with it, and with it alone, he would be able to tame the wild and untouchable Pegasus. Bellerophon woke to find the very same golden bridle lying beside him, no longer merely a dream, but a solid and gleaming gift resting in his own two hands. And he went, as the seer had further instructed him, to the spring of Pyrene, where Pegasus was known to come down and drink in the cool of the morning. And there, exactly as the goddess had promised, the golden bridle worked precisely as no ordinary rope or halter ever could have, and the great winged horse, wild and untamed by every other hand that had ever tried to approach him, allowed Bellerophon to slip the bridle over his head and mount him, and rose willingly into the sky beneath him, as though the horse himself understood, in whatever way horses understand such things, that this particular rider had been chosen and sent by the goddess herself. It is worth pausing here, before the fight itself, to notice the shape of the help Bellerophon received, because it will matter enormously by the end of this story. He did not tame Pegasus through his own strength or cunning alone. He received a divine gift, freely and generously given by a goddess who had chosen to favor him, and it was that gift, and not any innate quality of his own, that made everything which followed possible. Every hero this channel has followed owes some debt to help freely given, Jason to Medea, Perseus to Athena and Hermes, Theseus to Ariadne's thread, and the truest heroes among them are, almost without exception, the ones who remember that debt and carry it with humility even after their triumph. Hold that thought. It will matter again, very soon and very painfully. With Pegasus beneath him, Bellerophon flew to where the Chimera prowled, breathing its fire across the scorched Lycian countryside. And here his advantage finally became clear. On the ground, no mortal could approach the beast closely enough, to strike a killing blow, without being burned to ash long before any sword could land. But from the air, mounted on the one creature in all the world that could rise above the reach of that fire, Bellerophon could circle and dive and strike from angles no ground-bound warrior could ever have managed, forcing the monstrous creature to crane and twist and exhaust itself trying to track a threat it could never quite reach with tooth or flame. And here Bellerophon's own cleverness, and not merely his borrowed gift, finally entered the story properly, for he did not simply hack at the Chimera with an ordinary blade, which would likely have done little more than enrage a creature already breathing molten fire from its own throat. He fitted a great lump of lead to the tip of his spear, and as the beast reared up roaring, its fiery breath pouring from its lion's jaws, Bellerophon drove that lead-tipped spear directly into the open, burning mouth, and the Chimera's own fire, the very weapon that had made it unstoppable to every ground-bound attacker, did the rest of the work for him. The lead melted in the creature's own furnace of a throat, and the molten metal poured down into its insides, burning it from within with a fire it could not breathe out or escape. And the monster that had terrorized the whole of Lycia collapsed at last, killed by the very element that had made it so feared in the first place. Iobates, receiving news that the impossible task had somehow been accomplished, and that the young man he had fully expected to die in a field of ash was instead returning triumphant on the back of a winged horse, could scarcely believe it, and, still bound by the letter's grim command, and still unwilling to violate the guest law by killing him directly with his own hand, sent Bellerophon on task after task after task, each one calculated to be more dangerous than the last, hoping that if the Chimera itself could not finish him, some other trial surely would. He sent him against the Selimi, a fierce warrior people who had long troubled Lycia's borders, and Bellerophon defeated them. He sent him against the Amazons, the legendary warrior women whose name alone had struck fear into armies across Greece, and Bellerophon defeated them as well. And when even that failed to end him, Iobates resorted to a final and thoroughly dishonorable trick, setting an ambush of the finest and most dangerous warriors in all of Lycia to fall upon Bellerophon on his return journey, and cut him down where no open battle had managed to. Bellerophon, warned or simply prepared by now for exactly this kind of treachery, turned the ambush back upon the ambushers, and slew every single one of them, and rode home once more, victorious, having now survived every single trial a desperate and increasingly baffled king could think to throw at him. It was only then, faced with the plain and undeniable truth that this young man could not be killed by any monster or any army Lycia could set against him, that Iobates finally understood what should perhaps have been obvious from the very beginning, that a man so evidently favored by the gods themselves, capable of taming Pegasus and slaying the Chimera and surviving ambush after ambush, could not possibly be the villain Proetus's letter had accused him of being. He demanded, at last, to know the full truth of why his son-in-law had wanted this remarkable young man dead in the first place, and upon hearing it, or perhaps simply upon concluding, from the sheer weight of the evidence in front of him, that the original accusation could not possibly hold up against a man so clearly beloved of heaven, Iobates set the letter and its murderous request aside entirely. He welcomed Bellerophon properly at last, gave him his own daughter in marriage, and granted him half of his kingdom to rule as his own, so that a young exile who had once carried, unknowingly, the instructions for his own death, ended that particular chapter of his story, not merely alive, but a king in his own right, married, honored, and richer in glory than almost any other hero of that entire golden age. It would be a fitting and complete story if it ended here, exactly as so many of the tales we have followed on this channel end. The exile's blood guilt cleansed, the false accusation overcome, the impossible monster slain, the throne and the bride, both won through courage and divine favor, working hand in hand. And for a long while, it seems, this was exactly how the story was content to end, with Bellerophon ruling wisely and well, remembered, by every account of those middle years, as a generous and capable king. But pride in these old Greek stories is a slower and more patient poison than almost any other flaw a hero can carry, and it very rarely announces itself all at once. It creeps in quietly, across years of unbroken success, whispering the same seductive lie to every hero it eventually claims, that the favor which lifted you this high was never really borrowed at all, but earned and deserved, and yours to spend however far you wish to reach with it. For as the years passed, and Bellerophon's fame only grew, the slayer of the Chimera, the tamer of the only winged horse in the world, a king who had turned an assassination plot into a throne, something in him began to forget the shape of the gift that had made all of it possible in the first place. He began to forget that Pegasus had been Athena's to give, not his own by right, and that the golden bridle had come to him in a dream, sent by a goddess who could just as easily have withheld it. And one day, the old poets tell us, in the grip of a pride that had finally outgrown every ordinary mortal boundary, Bellerophon decided that if he could ride Pegasus above the reach of a fire-breathing monster, above the heads of armies, above every danger a mortal life could throw at him, then surely he could ride the same winged horse all the way up to Olympus itself, and take his place among the gods as an equal, rather than remaining merely their favored and grateful servant below. It is worth sitting with the particular audacity of that ambition for a moment, because it is different in kind from nearly every other flaw we have followed in this channel's heroes. Jason forgot a debt. Theseus forgot a promise. Narcissus could not see past his own reflection. But Bellerophon's flaw was larger and stranger than any of these. Not merely forgetting what he owed, but actively believing that he had earned the right to sit among the very powers who had lent him everything he possessed. He mounted Pegasus, and he turned the great horse's head, not toward any earthly errand this time, but straight upward, toward the clouds and the golden halls of Olympus far beyond them, intending to fly all the way to the summit and claim, by sheer audacity, a seat among the immortals themselves. Zeus, watching this presumption rise toward his own throne, was not inclined to allow it, and yet chose, in his response, something more precise and more pointed than an outright thunderbolt, as though even the king of the gods understood that Bellerophon's crime called for a punishment shaped exactly to its nature rather than simple annihilation. He sent a single gadfly, small and ordinary, and almost comically unworthy of the vast drama unfolding around it, to sting Pegasus at the height of his climb. And the great winged horse, startled and pained by so small and sudden a thing, after carrying his rider so calmly, through fire and battle and ambush, reared and bucked in the open sky, and Bellerophon, with nothing beneath him now but empty air where solid ground should have been, lost his hold and fell, down and down, a very long way down, from a height no other mortal in these old stories had ever climbed to before falling from it. He did not die in the fall, which was, in its own way, the cruelest part of the whole punishment for a swift death might almost have been a mercy compared to what actually followed. He survived, broken and crippled, landing in a thorn bush by some tellings that saved his life at the cost of blinding him, and he lived on afterward, the old poets tell us, not as a king any longer, and not as a celebrated hero either, but as a solitary and wretched wanderer, shunned by other men, avoiding every road that might bring him near another living soul, limping alone across the wild and empty places of the earth for the whole rest of his life, mourning a glory he had once possessed completely, and thrown away with a single act of overreaching pride. Pegasus, freed of his rider, flew on alone to Olympus without him, and was welcomed there, fittingly enough, not as a conqueror, but as a servant of the gods, given the honored task of carrying Zeus's own thunderbolts. The very horse that had once carried a mortal to unimaginable glory, now belonging fully and rightfully to the halls that mortal had tried, and failed, to force his way into by trickery and pride, rather than by patient and rightful favor. And so we return, at the end, to the particular shape of tragedy this story was built to describe. What is it, exactly, that separates a hero who receives a gift and honors it from a hero who receives the very same gift and eventually believes it was always simply his? Bellerophon began this story exactly as a hero should, grateful for his purification, faithful to the guest law, even when tempted to break it, humble enough to seek help from a seer and accept a bridle offered by a goddess rather than trying to tame Pegasus through brute stubbornness alone. Everything he achieved in the first half of his story, he achieved by remembering, at every step, exactly how much of it had been lent to him rather than earned outright. And everything he lost in the second half, he lost the moment he forgot same simple truth and began to believe that a life built almost entirely on borrowed divine favor somehow entitled him to climb higher, still, past every boundary that favor had ever actually promised him. It is a warning this channel has circled before, in different shapes and different heroes, but never quite so starkly as here, where the very same wings that once carried a man to impossible triumph became, in the space of a single reckless climb, the wings that let him fall from a height no other mortal had ever had the pride to reach for in the first place. Rest now. Let the great winged horse settle at last into his rightful place among the clouds of Olympus, thunderbolts resting quietly at his side, and let the old wanderer below finally lie down in some forgotten field, his climbing over, his reaching finally, painfully, at its end.